having said that, enchantment is also what human beings do. Our culture is constantly reweaving enchantment. We are culture-making creatures. We cannot stop producing enchantments. It was one of the things that I thought was fundamentally wrong with the New Atheist case, is that they kept behaving as if belief in something was actually optional and could be kind of deleted from the human animal. And actually humans always believe in something. They were like people frantically pruning a garden, which whenever they turned their back burst out wildly into kind of vines and strange trumpet-shaped flowers.
Well, hello there. Welcome to Re-enchanting, the podcast from Seen and Unseen at Lambeth Palace Library, part of the Centre for Cultural Witness. And you can find us at the website seenandunseen.com. I'm Justin Brierley.
And I'm Belle Tindall.
And we are so pleased today to be joined by Francis Spufford.
So pleased. I don't want to gush because that's unprofessional, but it's a true joy. I'm so excited.
Gushing is allowed.
Oh, okay.
I formally allow
Can
gushing.
I blush and simper in that case, please?
If I can gush, you can blush. I think that's the rule. Are you ready for your official introduction?
Yes.
It's quite long.
This is going to make you blush.
Are you going to enjoy this?
Okay, that's why I sort of set up the blushing in advance.
Francis is a celebrated author of both fiction and non-fiction. His award-winning titles include non-fiction works such as The Child That Books Built, which I love, as well as fiction such as Golden Hill, set in 18th century New York, and is the winner of the Costa Book Award for a first novel. And his most recent book, Light Perpetual, which I also really love, is longlisted for the 2021 Booker Prize. And Francis is also a professor at Goldsmiths College, where he teaches creative writing.
And the book that I first read of Francis was actually Unapologetic back in 2012. I love the subtitle of the book. I think you started the trend for long subtitles, Francis. Why, despite everything, Christianity can still make surprising emotional sense. And it was very much a book responding to the anti-religion of the New Atheism at the time, but also telling your own story of kind of walking away from faith and returning to it. So we're just fascinated to explore a bit of your story on the podcast today and to talk about the re-enchanting of reading and writing. So welcome along to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's great. We always start this podcast with the same question, and it's fitting. It's because we're on the top floor of a library. So our first question is always, what book is on your bedside table right now?
Three.
That's so often the answer, you know.
Yeah. And maybe this will fit the pattern as well. An early Virginia Woolf novel called Night and Day, which has been there for ages because I'm not sure what I think of it and I'm going really slowly. Jennifer Egan's The Candy House, which is new and I'm very excited by it, and which is a kind of sequel to A Visit from the Goon Squad, and the one I've just finished but which I haven't tidied away yet, which is R.H. Tawney's Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, which is great in a very, very different way.
Right.
Wow.
Well, there you go. I think we're probably, as we go through this podcast, going to find people always have a few books on the go. That seems to be the trend. The trend.
I think if you like books, you tend to want to have quite a lot of them around at all times.
I had a stack that developed on my bedside table until it became a bit of a danger. Actually, it might have fallen over in the night, and I eventually had to sort of clear them away,
like
because
the Leaning Tower of Pisa.
Exactly. Yeah.
You don't want injured in a book-related accident.
It was all the books I felt I wanted to read at some point but hadn't got round to, and I thought, well, anyway, it's lovely to have you on the podcast, Francis. I mean, reading, which is where we began, has obviously been a central part of your life. In fact, one of your best-known books was all about your journey with books as a child. What made you such a voracious reader when you were young, and I suppose what made you connect deeply as well with some of those stories you write about, some of the books you write about in the Child That Books Built?
I think I was. I probably have been a reading child anyway. I think I've got a kind of book-shaped mind anyway. But I was also reading for escape because I had a seriously ill younger sister, so I was particularly devoted to books that took you elsewhere. So I was partly reading for exit doors from the difficult things about daily life, which is probably why the whole central span of my childhood. The Narnia books were kind of essence of book for me, because they took you away through wardrobes and other kinds of doors, and that was what I wanted. But I couldn't be reading them all the time, so I read more or less continuously, and I belonged to the generation where the public libraries were in good nick. Insert angry political fist shaking here. So as well as buying puffin books with my pocket money, which you could do for 17.5p then, I know. I also always had a stack of library books on the go, and the 1970s were one of those kind of golden ages for children's books that come round on a cycle. There was another really good one in the 90s, and I suspect there's another one going on now. But I got the golden age of Joan Aiken and Peter Dickinson and Alan Garner, and just as children in the 90s got J.K. Rowling and Philip Pullman and all of that good lot.
Do you still read children's literature in that sense?
Not as continuously and voraciously as I used to, because other kinds of books have annexed my time. When my younger daughter was younger, I had a very nice kind of renewed burst of serious children's book reading. Kind of in tandem with what she was loving. And I will never stop reading children's books, but the pace has definitely slowed.
I sometimes wonder whether, do you feel that there's still that sort of, that books offer that kind of escape that you experience them as for young people, given all the other options that are now on the table for young people?
The thing about books escape is that it comes with a price ticket of effort.
Yes.
You have to work your way through the doors they represent. So in some ways they can be out-competed by kind of quicker, louder, more instant things. But they still work for people. There are still book-obsessed children, and also not every devoted reader starts off as a child reader. This is something I've become very aware of in the 20-odd years since I wrote. No, it's more than that. Since I wrote The Child That Books Built, there are all sorts of reading careers. There are people who read the first book that really mattered to them when they were 20, and you love books differently if you start later, possibly with a less kind of a less driven need for story. There are lots of ways of doing it. Thank heavens. Yeah.
Do you think, just talking about 20 years since The Child That Books Built, do you think it's time for a little sequel to The Man That Books have gone on
for
building?
Belle.
Just for me. I've got no vested interest in this question.
I think you need to write it yourself. I've been extremely determined never to repeat myself, often to the annoyance of my publishers, who
and
quite
me.
Sorry, but tough, basically. I've never written. I tend to now I'm writing novels. I tend to kind of block off the end of them so you can't have a sequel, which is mean. I know, but it takes me ages to write the things.
It's satisfying, though.
Yeah,
readers appreciate that as well.
Yeah. I mean, you've mentioned obviously the novels, because there was quite a shift 2016 when Golden Hill came out.
That was, yes, but I'd actually been leading up to it gradually. There was a sort of shading over middle period, because I've always I've always loved novels best as a reader, but I was too timid to write them.
Why did you feel safe with the non-fiction then?
Well, no, I thought then, and I still think now, that if you do it right, non-fiction could be as ambitious and imaginatively demanding and exciting as novels. But novels are my thing. I cannot deny. So I was, but they require a kind of confidence in your in how directly they show off your understanding of human beings. To write dialogue is to say, I know what the voices of other people sound like, and they sound like this. And I didn't quite let myself do that, but I was sneaking in more and more elements of novels, more and more imagined bits. In some ways, when I got to Unapologetic and provided a 1-chapter condensed version of the gospel, that was my inner novelist at work, as well as my inner other things. And in the end, I reached a book which was exactly halfway between fiction and non-fiction, about Russia, which had dialogue and invented characters alongside real history in it. And once I'd done that, it was like, a house where you enter through one door and then exit through another. And after that, I was kind of ready for.
You had this phased approach, and eventually
that sounds more planned and strategic than it actually was, Justin.
I mean, I read Golden Hill for the first time just last year, and enjoyed it so much. And I would have thought this was a seasoned novelist that I was reading, and obviously others felt the same way, because you obviously had all these tremendous awards for it being your first novel and so on.
I was more of a seasoned reader who knew what he liked and thought, I've been waiting a really long time, so this book is going to contain all the things I enjoy most in a novel, and it will have the rooftop chase and the trial scene and the tense card game for high stakes, and the ball and the witty badinage and the love story that may go terribly wrong, and the mystery and a description of snow, because I always like snow. So I was partly working down a long matured wish list with that book.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is it a bit like the band though that put out their first album, which has had all this thought and care for years and years, and then you've got your
Difficult second album
syndrome?
Yes. I have a brother-in-law who is a rock star whose second album was actually called Difficult Second Album for this exact
That's
reason.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think so. It just faces the problem straight on.
If he says it first.
Exactly. You need to get in. You need to get in with the self-deprecation before anybody else can deprecate you. Putting my writing teacher hat on, which is not this one, that was a metaphorical hat I was talking about. I always say to people that you shouldn't worry about using up everything that's in your cupboard, because the cupboard of your imagination refills by itself. So I wasn't, in fact, worried about not having anything else to say. What I did find difficult about the Difficult Second Album / novel was that I now discover, you don't actually become a novelist. You learn how to write that one, and then you start writing another one, and you still have to learn how to write this one as well, and the learning process just goes on and on and on.
That's great.
I'm fascinated. Everything you're saying, I'm fascinated by the strategies of writing, and of course you teach it, so that's somewhere you think a lot about how to write. How much do you think that can be taught, and then how much is it just something you've got within you, a gift in your DNA?
That is a bit of a how long is a piece of string question.
Sure.
I don't. All right, I know some things. I know that everyone's writing can improve, and that it's very helpful to be somewhere on a writing course where your writing is being taken seriously, and someone's expecting you to produce, and you're in conversation with other writers. Yes, there is a variation in natural talent, but you can be extremely good naturally and not actually do the work, or read enough, and it'll still go wrong. There is, thank heavens, a large middle ground where kind of genius is not enough, and effort is actually rewarded.
I was going to ask, do you obviously you're a professor at Goldsmiths College and you teach this stuff. How much pleasure do you get from, as it were, seeing others sort of develop those talents and that sort of thing?
Enormous. Because it's all so different. Books are more different from each other than almost anything else that goes around in the world under the same name. So everything that anybody is doing is its own success, and watching them grow is like a kind of it's a sort of garden where every single plant is a kind you haven't seen before, and up it comes. And sometimes it goes wrong, and sometimes it doesn't go wrong. But I'm not bored yet. Some of the connection between teaching writing and actually writing is the other way round, and I have learned things from my students. And I partly started writing fiction, dared to do it at last, because I was dispensing all this advice gaily to my students, and I thought, this is pathetic. You're not taking the... If you can tell them how to do it, then you really can dare to do it yourself.
When it came to the child that books built, you obviously had some autobiographical content in there.
Yeah.
But then you sort of closed the door on sort of what happened after childhood years, and you sort of opened it up a bit again with Unapologetic. In fact, you write that you were an atheist for 20 odd years, having grown up in a church setting. So just sketch out briefly what happened. Why did you turn your back on church?
Well, I'm going to respect my own privacy the way, in fact, I did in Unapologetic, because it seems to me that to write that book, I thought I needed to tell the personal story, because faith only makes sense in lives, and unless you describe where it's happening, it's abstract, and faith is never abstract. It's always seated in the lives of people. But I also didn't. I wanted to out myself as a sinner, because I am one, and in fact, so is everyone else, which is relieving for the amour propre. But without leaving a kind of sticky trail of embarrassment behind me. Yeah. So what I said in the book is what I'll say now, which is that I made one of the classic male mistakes in my marriage, and discovered that the resources I thought I had for dealing with serious emotional failure didn't do the job, and discovered instead, to my surprise, that there was a mercy I didn't have to provide myself, waiting for me if I went looking for it. And of course, one of the places I went looking for it was in church, because that's the way I'd been formed culturally. And my generation, church going was a lot more normal than it became later. And I wonder what happens now in the lives of people who don't necessarily think that I am in trouble. Where shall I look? And it just doesn't occur to them. But it occurred to me, and a kind of assurance of things being mendable came with it, and then step by step, historic Christianity made sense as well. And what I say in Unapologetic is that I absolutely recognise that there is an accidental element here. There is the accident of my background. There's the accident of time and place, and the fact that I come from a culture saturated in Christianity, even though it doesn't necessarily know it. So when I went looking for the divine, the Christian forms were just waiting for me, available. There is an element of accident in that, and yet my experience was that I was at each step cautiously testing it for emotional solidity and truth. I was kind of rapping my knuckles suspiciously on each piece of Christianity as it was as it appeared. Sounds a bit more ungrateful than I actually was, but I don't want to do the famous C.S. Lewis most reluctant convert in all England. Oh come on, Clive Staples, you undoubtedly weren't the most reluctant convert in all England. That's
It's
the
a good
human
line,
impulse.
though, isn't it?
It is a very good line, but that's the human impulse for drama, and I know how those work. I'm a writer, but I'm trying not to be too writerish about this.
Yes.
So. No, I wasn't reluctant. I was relieved and grateful, but I was suspicious and to some extent embarrassed, given that I'm British and male and of a certain generation, and religion is one of those subjects that comes thickly wrapped in tissue paper layers of embarrassment. So
I grew up in a family that all went to church, and I really relate. So you start the book Unapologetic by talking about your daughter, and you say, my daughter's 6 and she's about to find out that we're embarrassing because we go to church. And I relate to that so much. I could probably pinpoint the day that I realised my family's a bit embarrassing because we go to church. So I've said this to you already, but it's the book I wish I had written, Unapologetic. But it's also the book I'm very glad I didn't, because you did it perfectly.
It needs doing again over and over. And what Unapologetic was trying to do is this kind of culturally necessary but never finished task of going. Here's some personal stuff. Yeah. Here's some permanent stuff that comes out of history and theology. But here's the bridge that turned out to work for me between a personal history and a personal story and this thing over here, Christianity. And Christianity exists in the minds and hearts and possibly souls, let's not rule that one out, of believers, and it has to be represented and reimagined in every generation and every place and every culture, and all of, I'll say our meaning Christians, all of our predecessors did it. That's what medieval mystery plays are. That's what a lot of those oil paintings are. That's it. In order for the kind of for Christianity's stuff about eternity to fit together jigsaw piece wise with now, whenever now is, people have to do some connecting up. So Unapologetic was an attempt to connect up Christianity for that kind of moment full of rather shouting new atheists around 2010, 2012.
Yes. Well, it came very much in the wake of that publishing boom of, you know, God is Not Great, Chris Hitchens, The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins,
roll my eyes.
Sam Harris and all this. Sorry to give you palpitations. But in a sense, you know, there had already been responses, you know, the Alistair McGraths and the theologians and the apologists, you know, saying, well, look, here's a rational case. But your book was quite different to that, wasn't it? What were you trying to do?
Mine was ruder.
It was sweary. That was the main difference.
Let's be honest.
Absolutely sweary.
But also, all of those people were responsible in different ways for more than their own take. They were speaking from inside the church. Yes. They were attempting to answer argument with argument. They were hampered in the first place, I thought, by needing to be these responsible voices. I know the opposite of that is an irresponsible voice. Maybe
which is
was
possibly a good description of Unapologetic. But
Christianity has to be wild as well as tame, otherwise it's not kind of comprehensive.
It's not real otherwise.
Exactly.
Is it?
But I mean, so I thought there was a kind of tone of voice problem with a lot of the existing replies, in that they weren't free to move fast enough on their feet. And if Christopher Hitchens was doing eloquent scorn, there ought to be some eloquent scorn and eloquent jokes coming back, I thought. So there was that, but there was also my strong feeling that the book was fitting and, you know, filling an unfilled need, because there was just this basic error in the case against religion that was being made, in that it constantly treated it as an argument out of philosophy or out of science. It was about the existence of God, as I've said elsewhere, surely his most boring characteristic. Whereas people do not become or stay religious believers because they are possessed of an abstract conviction about the existence of God. They are Christians or Jews or Muslims because they have a strong need for the love of God and the mercy of God, and because they feel that they're getting it. It's an emotional thing. It's not really an argument about cosmology. And though the arguments from cosmology or from evolutionary biology going, actually, Mr. Dawkins, that doesn't follow. Sorry, Professor Dawkins, that doesn't follow, were good and necessary. I didn't think that they actually dealt with the fundamental problem, which is that he was having the wrong argument. He kept pulling religion away and trying to treat it as kind of some sort of dodgy inferior grade science. And it isn't. It's something else. And I'm getting worked up, and it's been a decade.
It's been over 10 years since you did it.
I could calm down now. And in fact, what I was trying to say at the beginning of this was that somebody else needs to do it again. Somebody else who's not me, because the cultural moment has moved on.
This is your moment,
The
Belle.
new atheists have calmed down. Yes, off
that
you go.
Everything you're offering is proving yourself wrong. It's still in you, I can tell. The fire still burns. I'd like to challenge your never repeating yourself clause, if I may. You end the book. I talked about the beginning. I may as well talk about the end. You write that Christianity makes hopeful sense. It makes realistic sense, and it makes, and this is my favorite, battered about but still trying sense.
Yeah.
And so we're 10, 11-ish years on from that, and if we think about the type of Christianity that's being portrayed, it's still that battered about but still trying sense that is catching people's eye. So I'm thinking about, I don't know if you've read it, but Nick Cave and Sean O'Hagan's book. Have you read that?
I haven't read it, but I keep being told I must read it, and I will. I read a piece about his the interview with Rowan Williams. I think I thought it was fascinating.
Well,
Hope, Faith, and Carnage.
Hope, Faith, and Carnage. I recommend it to anyone that's listening, and it's because what I would say is that it's an ode to a battered about but still trying. Kind of Christianity.
No, that will be appearing on my bedside table.
Oh yeah, please. And it's caught so much attention. And also there's a film out at the moment, an amazing film called Women Talking. And again, it seems that if Christianity doesn't make sense in 3D, it's not worth it, and people aren't interested. So what's so interesting is, okay, we're 10 years, 11 years down the line, and yet people are still craving the exact type of Christianity that you're talking about, the type that's lived out day to day.
And I think it's about that voice as well, because I think the reason that there's been so much interest in Nick Cave's book is because he's not necessarily the person people expected to start talking about faith and Jesus and church. And so it's when someone with that voice, and he can be sweary as well, so, but there's a sense in which it just makes it less tame and sort of churchy, and it's just somehow makes it kind of suddenly, I think people realize, normal people believe this stuff. It's
also, and the whole range of normal people behave it too. Believe it too. From rock stars right round the kind of human compass. I think the important thing is escaping from the constrained tones of voice, the ones that suggest that religion only belongs in some quiet little corner of the human zoo, and that it will disappear in a kind of puff of bad feeling if we raise our voices. And you don't have to be sweary to talk about religion. I sometimes regret that I settled on the sweary way of disrupting the expected tone of voice in Unapologetic. I'm glad you quite liked it. I quite liked it at the time, but the result is that's only one way of speaking naturally, and it's quite a blokey way of it too. And every now and again I meet someone who's disappointed that I'm not in fact quite the speaker in Unapologetic.
You're that Larry chap.
I'm
that
not.
We seem
No,
to
I'm
meet
not.
in
I'm
that
quite
book.
polite, and I certainly don't swear in churches. But it was a good enough solution at the time. But there are lots of other ones too.
Yeah.
What's important is a natural voice that comes out of experience and is not afraid of the hard bits, which is all of the bits of human experience that can't be wrapped tidily up. And what I hear about the Nick Cave book is that he found faith in exactly one of those kind of dark pits where there were no easy answers, which is one of faith's abodes for those who find themselves looking for it there.
Yeah, but it can hold carnage. But the faith and hope can hold and sit alongside carnage. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And can be found inside carnage.
Inside carnage, absolutely. You are sort of going back to your writing a little bit in that you're not, I hope this is fair to say, a Christian writer, but you're a writer who happens to be a Christian. And how does that nuance, how do you feel that nuance plays out in your work? And is that an important nuance to keep, or actually doesn't really matter?
It probably does matter. And to be kind of crude and commercial about it, it's a help to me to be a mainstream writer who is known to have this weird connection.
Occasionally writes odd books about Christianity.
Yeah. Also, this is one of the unfair things about trying to reply to the New Atheists. I could be heard because I already had a mainstream platform.
Yes.
And Nick Cave could be heard because he's Nick Cave.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Sure.
But one should use these advantages when one has got them. It's a neat formula, and I've used it myself. The writer who happens to be a Christian rather than a Christian writer, but I think the line is actually really blurrier than that, because you write out of everything you understand about the world, and faith is kind of basic by now to the way I understand the world, and it comes up even when I'm not meaning to put it in. So it's not incidental. Happens to be a Christian sounds as if it's a kind of optional add-on for me, and it's not. On the other hand, it doesn't ever limit my choice of subject matter or my sense of having a free hand in how to make a book. And it's probably significant that I tend not to write stories about well-behaved Christians trying hard in Christian communities. So I'm not describing the life of faith, except incidentally. What I tend to be describing is the more chaotic behaviour of those whose lives, without them necessarily knowing it, kind of echoes the kind of the deep Christian themes. I've sometimes thought of myself as being like a person with a sheet of paper who's holding a magnet underneath it. And you pour the iron filings on top of the piece of paper, and they go into a shape.
Yes.
It's the Christian gospel under there that's being the magnet. And I find that the stories I want to tell without thinking it through fall into a kind of redemption shape. Because of the magnet I've got underneath the piece of paper.
I mean, when I read Golden Hill, it was just a great read, and it's a wonderful way in which you kind of tell the story. But obviously, I noticed kind of as a Christian, you know, the bits where obviously the hero is kind of goes to the church and has those moments of kind of grace in this kind of very up and down story of his life, and it's not, you know, it's not as though the church is presented as some perfect sanctuary. There's judgmentalism, there's, you know, but there's still something about the way that you describe the experience of just being able to be somewhere where suddenly he feels like he can give his problems and his, you know, the awfulness of his situation over to something else, even for a moment. And I just really enjoyed the way that you weave that in. And obviously that's not necessarily something who is writing will necessarily include in their story, because they don't have your experience of that being the way that you've experienced church, and therefore you can tell that for someone else.
And it's a matter of kind of artistic integrity, that the story should work even if you are a non-believer reading it and you don't get those dimensions of it. But yes, and I wanted to treat the availability of a church in 18th century New York as a natural part of the landscape, which it was. Absolutely. And I wanted the kind of the chaotic adventures of my hero, Mr. Smith, in New York to mean that he bounced into church in a state of guilt quite as often as he bounced catastrophically into people's beds in a state of excitement.
Exactly. Yeah. I loved it.
Yeah. Okay, this is one of the natural fits for me between writing novels and Christianity, is that Christianity is an anti-perfectionist religion. At least the non-heretical versions of it are. You can let's not go there anyway.
Well,
but
there are other versions
mainstream
around,
Christianity
Understood.
expects human beings to screw up, to be polite about it, and they
HTPFU, as you
thank
put
you.
it.
What a good phrase! I must remember that. So for me, it is a warrant for a kind of for as universal a sympathy and curiosity as you can manage about all of the different ways that human lives work out. It is not for us to judge or to limit our sympathy when, as believers, we don't think God limits his sympathy. Who are we, as Pope Francis said, who are we to judge? That doesn't mean that you have no moral framework. It doesn't mean you don't think that some actions are, blimey, terrible. But on the other hand, your human sympathy does not stop at some arbitrary brink. And this goes well with novels, as far as I'm concerned.
We have Marilyn Robinson coming and joining us as part of this series. I'll say that into the camera. We have Marilyn Robinson coming.
You have Marilyn Robinson.
She will be appearing on a future episode.
On a future episode. And she said, which you just teed it up perfectly. She says, I think fiction may be, whatever else, an exercise in the capacity for imaginative love or sympathy or identification. And so I think... is there something about writing fiction, something about escaping, something about creating and inhabiting a world, something about those iron filings that can sort of help you sort of, the site that hosts this is called Seen and Unseen, can sort of help you enter the world into the unseen, into the more mysterious? Is writing a good doorway into those things?
Oh, it's a very fallible doorway. And the unfair thing about writing is that you're allowed to keep your best efforts at sympathy and then delete all the failed
Sure,
ones. It's a highly edited version of the spiritual life. Let's say you get to show off the good bits and delete the bad bits, which is not actually how the rest of human behaviour works. Yes, I think so. As well as that remark of Marilyn Robinson's, I'm thinking of Simone Weil saying attention to other human beings as such is love. And it's true that the effort of looking hard at people who aren't you, the discipline of paying attention to people who aren't you, is itself a kind of love, an ungreedy love, not the kind that wants a return or that wants anything from them. And mystery sits nearest to us in the mystery of the other people in front of us. The people 4 feet away from me on the other side of this table don't have direct access to your minds, hearts, or souls. I can only get there with imagination, and there is something about the effort of doing that which fits with, and maybe if you're very lucky, leads to other kinds of attention. But we don't have to do it all ourselves, because if you are a Christian, then you can feel that you can count on God paying attention to us. Thank heavens, our own capacities are not the limit of our ability to feel or to notice or to understand in some faint glimmering kind of way.
I mean, coming back to the Narnia novels that you were sort of captivated by as a child, that's obviously a kind of, one of those examples of being able to be lost in an imaginary world and sort of, and so on. And I've always been intrigued by the fact, in the sense that Lewis kind of started writing children's fiction and that sort of fantasy literature sort of quite late in his writing life, and he started really after his conversion, with the sort of more objective case for Christianity type stuff, Mere Christianity, The Problem of Pain, and so on. I've heard it said that perhaps he almost realised that there's a limit to what that can do, and actually it's really the imagination is where the game's at when it comes to inspiring people to think about things beyond what's in front of you. Is that something you sort of can see as well?
Yes, I agree. And I think it was probably truer, in fact, to the springs of his own kind of ascent to Christianity. If I remember rightly, the way that Tolkien finally closes the Christian deal with C.S. Lewis is he says, kind of, how you respond to stories.
Yeah.
Okay. imagine a story that you respond to with whole heart like that. Only this one happens to be true.
Yeah.
It's a story-shaped faith when it comes to him, and obviously he was very good at arguing. He was a great rhetorician with, in some ways, a temptation towards the kind of the knockdown argument. And some of his knockdown arguments, I have to reveal, don't always hold up if you look at them skeptically, but the imagination does.
Yes.
And I think that the turn towards Narnia and children's books they're not a sign of defeat in argument, but I think they are a sign of him recognizing that you go beyond argument, where you offer the story instead.
I think there was an article he wrote for, I can't remember exactly what it was. I think it was the New York Review or something, and he had this phrase about using literature and imagination and fantasy writing to tell effectively religious stories, and he used this phrase. I think it was something like imagination helps us to steal past the watchful dragons. There's this sense in which I think he saw it as a way of getting past people's defenses, and I again, coming back to yours, I feel almost like the way you tried to say, look, let's look at Christianity from this emotional point of view. It sort of says, let's not worry too much at this point about, the reason and the sort of can a God really exist in this material universe? And there was a sense in which you appeal to that, whichever one it is, like left or right side of the brain.
I can
to
never
say
remember either.
That there's something holistic about the way we talk about God, and it can never be just a purely that rational side of your brain. It has to appeal to this imaginative side.
I am a strong valuer of the rational side of our brains as well, and I think the watchful dragons analogy is some ways slightly misleading, because we need the watchful dragons to save us from all of the various frauds, impostures, and forms of bullshit that which the world is so rich. It's just that there's some things they can't watch for us, and I don't think we need to steal past them, but we need to supplement them with other kinds of perception. I also don't like the idea of outwitting people's defences, because on the whole they need their defences, and you shouldn't have to, I suppose. Oh heavens! No, there is Christian warrant for breaking in like a thief in the night, isn't there? Curses! But
you don't want to be, in a sense, tricking people.
No, you don't. But what you want is to. Hang on. No, we need to, let's pause and distinguish a bit here. There's what you'd want to do if you were doing successful apologetics. That's one thing, and there's also what you want to do if you were just attempting to be as truthful as you could about the world as you actually understood it. And one of them is a bit more rhetorical than the other. No, you don't want to trick people, but you want to show the reason for the hope that is in you, as the Epistle of Peter says in the New Testament, and that kind of showing has got as much to do with storytelling and with the exchange of what you have understood and felt, not in the expectation that it will arm twist somebody else into feeling something they're not naturally feeling, but as a way of going, which is kind of necessary in the modern world. There are large areas of human life where there are things to recognise where contemporary culture doesn't do a very good job of giving us a vocabulary. You know those uneasy feelings you have sometimes. Well, actually, there are ways of talking about them. This is recognisable territory. You are not lost in an uncharted wilderness where no one has ever been before. When you feel depressed or worthless, there are ways of talking about this, and it's an offer. It's not a. It's not persuasion. Persuasion implies overcoming.
Yes.
Overcoming a resistance. People usually have good reasons for resistance. It's a way of going. this has been helpful to me. Here it is. Why not compare?
I wonder if, so obviously this podcast is called Re-enchanting.
Yes.
And it's a sort of a pushback, not pushback, an acknowledgement, and then a response to disenchantment, from Max Weber. And I wonder if part of it is, we're living in this age, arguably, some would say that we're not, but of disenchantment, and stories, feelings, all of that can't be measured, and it's not so easily explained, and it's not so easily analysed. So I wonder if this idea that we don't have emotional vocabulary for ourselves, whether religious or just generally, and we sort of have lost power in our own stories and the power of those, or lost confidence in the power of them, I wonder if all of that is sort of almost a symptom of this disenchantment that we think, because we haven't got vocabulary to completely and utterly explain this feeling and put it in a neat box and then present it to the world. We won't present it to the world at all.
Yeah.
And the same with our stories, because they're messy, because they involve a bit of carnage, and because we can't measure the success of them yet, we won't present them to the world yet.
Yeah.
Do you think that might sort of be a bit of a connection to that?
Yes. I think the world is both disenchanted and also not. I buy the kind of the argument you get from Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, that we've gone fundamentally from a world of porous selves where the air is enchanted, and there are unseen forces all around us, to one in which our fundamental model of human beings is what he calls the buffered self, and the world is lacking in the old kind of enchanted powers. But having said that, enchantment is also what human beings do. Our culture is constantly reweaving enchantment from whatever feelings, whatever materials are available. We're like kind of, what are those things? Caddis flies that make their larvas from make their casings from anything around. And we are culture making creatures. We cannot stop producing enchantments. It was one of the things that I thought was fundamentally wrong with the new atheist case, is that they kept behaving as if belief in something was actually optional and could be kind of deleted from the human animal. And actually humans always believe in something. They were like people frantically pruning a garden, which whenever they turned their back burst out wildly into kind of vines and strange trumpet-shaped flowers. So as I said in Unapologetic, I think the choice is really a choice of enchantments, but the enchantments that grow in a world which has been disenchanted in the kind of Charles Taylor or Max Weber sense are often different from the past ones. They're more ad hoc and impromptu and made people think themselves personally. They often, the materials to hand are kind of amazingly commercial and have been sort of pushed upon you. So a lot of what people feel is most individual about themselves often turns out to be straight off TikTok, as far as I can see. Nevertheless, people are constantly making meaning, because we are meaning-making creatures. So,
but isn't the argument of the new atheist though exactly? Well, yes, and that's where this story of yours comes from, Francis. And and literally, I can think of the title of one of the key new atheist Daniel Dennett's book was Unweaving the Spell. It was literally about disenchanting.
My point is that if you unweave this spell, another spell will rapidly reweave itself even faster behind your back. And I and J.R.R. Tolkien are leaning into your podcast to go, yes, but what about a really good story that happens to be true?
Right. Yes.
We can't prove it's true, obviously, but.
Indeed, and you don't attempt to do that in Apologetic. You really are just about saying, you're always making people want it to be true, appealing to their kind of...
Well, that would be the beginning, but also you'd want it to be... You'd need to know that you were wanting it to be true not out of a desire to evade hard truths. You wouldn't want it to be true because you wanted the world to be wrapped in pink cotton wool, or that you wanted a happy ever after story which was inconsistent with the dignity of scientific adulthood, which is the way I think some new atheists take it. They think it's wish fulfillment, whereas actually Christianity seems more rueful and bruised than that to me. Not wish fulfillment, but in some ways a difficult recognition that we're not the masters of our own intentions, and we don't get to choose what we are exactly.
It's interesting to me that in a sense, though, 10 or more years on since you wrote that book, maybe it did the job, because I feel like the new atheists, well, where are these books now? I mean,
Justin, I'm not sure that was me.
It's all down to Unapologetic. I mean, what
no,
I'm really
not unless
is,
I have to own megalomania as well, which I'm really
I'm
not going
saying
to.
you were the one factor that led to the fall of new atheism. But no, what I mean really is that it feels like it was a moment of its time, and I suppose my question for you is if Belle's going to write the follow-up book, what is she actually responding to now?
Listening.
Yeah, that's true.
What are we responding to now? We don't have that big phalanx of these old new atheists.
True.
Creating this sort of quite neat and tidy, actually, kind of oppositional sort of force. What are we actually looking at now?
I think this gets us back to enchantment, and I don't want to write your book for you, Belle.
Please provide the material and the endorsements.
Okay, the new atheist moment had a lot to do with generations. It was both a symptom of religion receding and something that could only happen before it had receded the whole way. Because if you look at the generation of people represented by Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and co., they were all people who had been formed reluctantly by sitting miserably through school assemblies and having to sing All Things Bright and Beautiful, and they got the last bit of British kind of public culture Christianity and didn't like it very much, and were very ready to blame it for everything kind of irrational and oppressive and old and nasty in human experience. But I think, and they had a younger audience who found the aggression and the simplicity refreshing. And I think most of them could only believe it because they didn't actually have very much felt experience of religion to kind of cross-check it against. Otherwise you'd go, hang on, that really doesn't sound very much like the churchgoers I know. But both of those moments have passed away. People don't, there's an opportunity and a problem for anyone who wants to talk religion now, which is that the last bits of inherited Christianity, I think, are going. So there's more of a blank. So one thing that a book like Unapologetic now would need to talk into is even less kind of literacy in what the old answers to complicated human problems used to be. But also, they need to talk into all of the new kinds of enchantment which we're being offered, and I'm really not the person to do it. I am too old to speak vigorously into the kind of the.
You're being slightly coy about what those new enchantments are, but are you thinking of I don't know the ideology, some of these kind of ideologies currently floating around, identity and sexuality and everything else, or? What?
Not necessarily, no, but more what they represent developments of, what is behind them, which are attempts at human perfectionism again, I think, but in new forms. It's a heresy. It's Pelagianism. It's the idea that we can hoist ourselves by our own bootstraps, and that any transformation we require, we are capable of ourselves. And it hasn't been true ever, but it is culturally potent, and it is the simple answer to the broken heart. it offers to mend things by going, you're very powerful.
Right.
And it is only a consequence of oppression that you feel sad, and that if we took it away, you'd be great. And sometimes, oppression is a real thing.
Course.
That's why there are generous things in contemporary culture which I'd want to applaud, but
it's not necessarily going to be the answer in that sense to the old human problem of
quite.
us.
But I mean, in any plausible society, humans will be humans, and that means that we will be coping with our
propensity to F things up, basically.
Yeah, basically. And the institutional consequences of those as well, because we aren't solitary creatures, so we live surrounded by all of the complex multi-generational products of our tendency to F things up in public as well as private ways. But that sounds too simple. And as my manifesto would be for generous curiosity, and to look for the sympathetic good in absolutely everything. But the truth is, I don't know how to name contemporary enchantments well, and I can feel that I am passing out of kind of tactile, quick sympathy with what's in the head of a 20-year-old now. And somebody who knows the answer to that needs to be writing into that, not me. I'm terribly old.
We still want a few books out of you before you pop your clogs.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I can do that.
Gosh, there's like 5 different questions 5 different places I could go down, but I won't. We should wrap things up with one final question. If
You're
that's
not going to
okay.
ask me to sing, are you?
No,
I'm not going to sing.
That could be a brand new part of the podcast each
How
week.
we end every podcast.
Yeah.
How do you think Marilyn Robinson would feel about it?
I'm not sure. I'm tempted to not ask her because she might cancel the recording. So
Okay, let's keep it much more tame.
All right.
We've spoken about re-enchantment, just sort of very briefly. Writing, words, stories, all of that is your thing, and very much I love all of that as well. I'm wondering, what would re-enchantment in that sphere look like?
The cheap answer is like my next book.
I'm sure your publicist would love that answer.
No, but I am going to write a fantasy novel next because the burgeoning of fantasy is one of the ways that the world desperately tries to re-enchant itself. It's interesting. As literal belief in magic vanishes, kind of metaphorical belief in magic sells 1 million copies. And that's not my motive for doing it. But
wouldn't hurt.
But I'm interested in what a less realistic kind of imagination could do. So but I make books. I don't fight cultural battles. I make objects. I whittle. So I'll go and whittle.
I think that whittling does fight, I think.
It's been a fascinating conversation, Frances, and I hope whatever the next book is, that I know that I will be reading it and being enchanted. So thank you for coming on, and I thank you for what you do in your sphere to help other people kind of encounter something bigger than the world in front of them. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I hope we can have another one, perhaps in 10 years when you have written this follow-up to Unapologetic.
Oh, all right.
Yeah. That's recorded. There's proof of that now,
Yes, absolutely. We'll get on to the publisher immediately. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been great to talk.
Thank you for having me.